the passion and the intensity with which high-level rivalry games are played at the college level have a certain uniqueness and a certain romanticism about them that really embodies what college football is all about. I wanted to explain briefly on this show how unique and, to me, very underrated the Georgia-Auburn rivalry is. It's called the Deep South's oldest rivalry, and it has a lot to do with you, maybe, even if you're not a fan of Georgia or Auburn. I'll explain to you how that applies in just a second. It's a very underrated rivalry. It's a regional rivalry. Now, if you're where I'm from, if you're down in the South, it's a pretty big deal the week that it happens. For Georgia and Auburn fans, it's a big deal year-round. You guys talk about it year-round. You live right next to each other. It's a border rivalry. So you guys talk about it. People in Wyoming, they don't really know a whole lot about Georgia-Auburn. People in Tempe, Arizona, they don't really talk about Georgia versus Auburn. They talk about Auburn versus Alabama. Maybe they even talk about Georgia versus Florida, which brings me to my next point. Here's part one of the unique aspect of this rivalry. Neither of these teams would call the other their arch rival. Of course, for Auburn, you've got Alabama. Of course, for Georgia, you've got Florida. And yet, here's where it gets complicated. Now, I want you to follow me here. This is not going to make sense to some of you, especially and even up to and including some Auburn fans. This may not make sense to you. There is a big difference. Here's what I want you to understand. There's a big difference in Auburn fans who live in West Alabama, for example, Livingston, Alabama, let's say, versus Auburn fans who live in West Georgia. Auburn's about 30 minutes from the Georgia border. So if you talk about the 185 corridor and the 85 corridor all the way up 75 to Tennessee, you got towns like Columbus, where I'm from. Huge Auburn alumni and fan base there. LaGrange, Noonan, Atlanta has a massive contingency of Auburn alum, Auburn fan. There are a bunch of Auburn folks there, a bunch of orange and blue in Atlanta. And then you go up north, you got Rome, you got all these towns all the way up to Chattanooga. So there are a lot of Auburn folks who live in Georgia. They are not going to try and convince you that Georgia is a bigger rival for them than Alabama. But here's what a lot of them will tell you. And this is not something that gets broadcast nationally. And I think this is something that doesn't even make a lot of sense to some of their own brethren who live in the Yellowhammer state of Alabama. There are a lot of Auburn folks who hate Georgia more than they hate Alabama. There are a lot of Auburn folks, most recently, 2 and 3 years ago, when Alabama and Georgia played each other, once for an SEC championship, once for a national championship. They'll go like this. They'll take a wooden spoon and they'll put it between their teeth and they'll say, yeah, I pull for Alabama. Believe it or not, I wanted Saban to beat Kirby Smart. Now, what sense does that make? Why in the world would you be pulling for your arch rival? Well, here's what some Auburn fans will tell you. Some Auburn folks will tell you, I despise at a cellular level the University of Alabama, everything they stand for, everything they represent, and I despise at a cellular, molecular level Nick Saban. But here's the bottom line. That guy's great. And Alabama is on an unprecedented run right now. And it's not that we like it, but we have come to terms with it. So that is what it is. And so you go back a couple of years, and I tell you, and I'm dead serious because I got a ton of Auburn buddies who will validate this claim, most of whom live either close to or in the state of Georgia, that there were a bunch of Auburn folks pulling for Alabama when they played Georgia. And here was their reasoning. Number one, they have to live around Georgia folks. And I'll give you more on what the rub there, aside from the obvious, is in a second. But the second thing that they said from just a practical standpoint is, well, these two teams are matching up. What does more damage to us if we're Auburn? What does more damage here? Here's what I kept hearing. It made sense the more I thought about it. They said another national championship for Nick Saban in Alabama would mean what to us? In the grand scheme of things, we would hate it. You know, it wouldn't be a fun thing for us to watch, but it wouldn't really have a whole lot of impact on Auburn if Nick Saban has 5 championships at Alabama versus 4 championships at Alabama. But what happens if Kirby Smart at Georgia wins their first national championship in darn near 4 decades? What does that do to us? Potentially a lot. Auburn heavily recruits the state of Georgia, but here's what they'd be comfortable with. They'd be comfortable, not happy, but comfortable with Bama winning one more. What they can't have is the University of Georgia as a program bypassing them. Now, you may think, and even I may think, that Georgia has bypassed Auburn as a program. They don't think that. And if they do believe Georgia's bypassed them, it's still very competitive. Unlike Alabama, Alabama's on a decade-plus long run right now, the likes of which the sport may never see again. Hadn't seen it in a long time. Georgia, Certainly, they've been close, but they haven't won a national championship. Georgia's won an SEC championship, but even the same year they won that, Auburn folks will tell you, hey, we smoked them in our own building. Now, Georgia folks will come right back at you and say, what have we won? I think, Collins, like 12 of the last 15 or 11 of the last 15. Georgia has had the upper hand in this rivalry, but Auburn folks don't look at Georgia as superior to them. They may look at what Alabama's doing right now and even have to admit that's superior. They don't look at Georgia the same way. So they wouldn't be comfortable with that. That is, in short, relatively speaking, the explainer as to why maybe a lot of these Auburn folks, depending on where they're situated, would pull for Alabama even over Georgia. Georgia fans, it's a very interesting dynamic in the state of Georgia, where I live. There's a lot of passion, and when Kirby Smart took the job, we talked about this on the last show, there were a lot of factors there where I thought criticism levied towards Mark Richt, and the comparison now between Smart and Richt doesn't make a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. If you missed that, watch the last show and I'll explain it to you. But there is very, very unique sort of set of circumstances in place in the state of Georgia and close to it, right around that Chattahoochee River border, where unless you're on the ground there, you don't really experience it. But if you've been around Auburn folks who live in the state of Georgia and live with Georgia fans, they'll tell you. A lot of them just flat out tell you they hate Georgia more than Alabama. But even the ones who will tell you, yeah, I mean, Bama's Bama. They're the big rival. But, man, if those two play each other, I gotta admit to you, I pull for Alabama over Georgia. If they win one more, they win one more. I cannot live with Georgia winning one because here's the fallback. Doesn't matter how many you've won in a rivalry. I mean, it does, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as when an Auburn fan can sit there and grin at you as you explain this to them, and then you look at them and you say, what are you grinning at? What are you grinning for? And then they reach in their back pocket, and you know what they pull out. They pull out a national championship from 2010. They pull out a Heisman, and they pull out a national championship from 2010. And they lay it on the table, and they lean back very arrogantly, and they say, where's yours? And then you do what Kirby's doing right now, surrender Cobra. You don't have one. And that's all that really is standing in that context between you two. And that's what an Auburn fan doesn't want to see you have anytime soon. So that's the explanation. It's a very, very unique rivalry. I'll be honest with you as we transition here. When Smart got to Georgia, I remember having some high school coaches tell me that this is going to impact Auburn in a very negative way. So I said, why? I mean, there were some obvious reasons maybe, but I said, why? They said, think about the landscape in the SEC right now, recruiting landscape. Okay, Alabama's rolling, so Auburn is certainly not going to dominate in-state with the kids that Alabama wants. They're probably not going to dominate there. They need to recruit the state of Georgia heavily, and if a dynamite recruiter comes into Georgia and locks down the state, this is something that people have predicted to happen for 40 years, and no one's ever done it. No one locks the state of Georgia down for, again, many reasons, many of which we have discussed in the last month. But there was this fear that all of a sudden Auburn would sort of be out on an island and they wouldn't have, from the time they used to be real big in South Florida, but a lot of their staff moved on and they're not quite as strong there anymore. They used to dip their toe heavily into Louisiana and East Texas, but hey, LSU's rolling right now there, so can we go there and depend on that to deliver us a perennial top 10 class? There was this thinking that Smart coming to Georgia was going to slam the door on a lot of kids that Auburn used to get out of that 185 and 85 corridor. Again, Columbus, LaGrange, Noonan, Atlanta. And I won't say that heads up, Auburn has dominated Georgia, but they've held their own in recruiting. They've done good enough there, and they've done good enough just overall recruiting all of those areas that I just talked about to the point where they're putting together some of their best recruiting classes right now. I mean, Gus Malzahn, a lot of folks talk about how much he's underachieved, and I couldn't disagree more. And maybe we'll talk about this coming week. I don't know if we have time. Yes, I do. We will have time. I don't think he's underachieved at all. I mean, how many of these other head coaches have beaten Nick Saban multiple times? And how many people are parked in the same state as Nick Saban, across the river from Kirby Smart, just up the road from Ed Orgeron and the defending national champion LSU Tigers, and recruiting at a top 10 level? Like, how many other coaches out there are doing that? How many of them are equipped to do that? I don't know the answer to that. I just know the answer is not very many. Whatever the number is, it's not very many. It's all relative. Because you and I know, if I were to pluck Auburn, grab claw machine time, we're grabbing Auburn, and And let's just trade the ACC for a second. Let's negotiate a trade. Auburn and NC State. What's Malzahn doing in the ACC? I'm not telling you he's overtaking Dabo anytime soon, but behind Dabo, behind Clemson, what's Auburn doing in the ACC right now? They're a perennial 10 or 11 win team. You would view him completely different. Nothing changed. All that changed about the man in the program is the geographical fencing. I just put him in a different compound over here. So it's all relative. This underachieving sort of nexus within the SEC universe, the broad brush he gets painted with, it's all relative. And sometimes it's relatively wrong.